So let's talk about philosophy. So obviously, it's a genre that you don't slip into casually. It's something you have to go super deep on, no pun intended. What are some of the early things that resonated with you about philosophy?
I mean, I think a lot like the music industry, I just kind of found myself here, which is, I really wish I had a better story about this. I'm like, no, I was driven, and it's one of these things where I kind of stumbled into it as a teenager and was like, wow, I really like this. And then somehow, we were doing band stuff, and I got really interested in it in college, so that's what I pursued. And I went to grad school for, I was super interested in still doing philosophy, but for lack of any other plan, it was just like, oh, this is what you do next. So I decided, oh, let's go get a PhD. So I went and did that for 5 years and got a PhD. It was not as thought out as you would hope, especially given the topic. But yeah, I've always just been really attracted to that, I guess, genre of literature, that way of looking at the world. And I think the more I read it, the more I became intellectually curious about it. And I don't know if I would say that it. I don't know if I would say I had this I wasn't walking around going, God, what's the meaning of life? It's not this kind of vague sense in which I was driven, but I just always found it fascinating. And, interacting with a lot of people, other philosophers, I guess, and talking about this kind of literature in conjunction with issues in the history of science and the history of culture, I guess. I mean, it's always just a fascinating thing. And it's, you get to have these conversations that are very, for reasons that aren't particularly clear to me, are very difficult to have on a day-by-day basis, right? So, you're not standing outside a show going, so we're trying to figure out how we merge humanistic and scientific pictures of mankind. So how does that look like? Or how should we think of gender? This is a complicated issue in 2020. You can't have these conversations, and you should, but I think it's hard to do a lot of the time. So I was really driven by, I guess, being able to have these conversations, and especially grad school and going to get a PhD. I was very fortunate to be surrounded, to have a 5-year period of my life where I was immersed in and surrounded by people who are all just as intellectually curious. And I just got to talk about this stuff all the time, which probably drove everyone else that wasn't in grad school fucking crazy because I talk about stuff all the time. But it was great. No matter what you're doing, if you ever get a chance to really be immersed in it for a couple of years, whether it's, selling makeup or creating video games or anything, it doesn't matter what it is. I really can't suggest doing that enough, because I think it's something that as you get caught up in what you're doing and, you lose the ability to be focused like that or to ignore the financially disastrous consequences of being immersed in one thing. But it's great. I don't know. I feel like I didn't answer your question at all, but that was
No. I mean, you did, because you're talking. I mean, you give me a non-answer, but then you also give me a longer answer. But
David Lee Roth always said, you just say what you want to see in print. You don't answer the question. You just say what you want people to see in print, right? It's like his famous interview strategy.
Good old Diamond Dave. Getting some echo again. What was I going to say? So you mentioned something earlier that was interesting. You were talking about just being immersed in it. Is there any particular genre or aspect of philosophy that you went super deep on, or that as you went to grad school or earlier that you found really fascinating?
Yeah, I got really interested in the history of philosophy, or how we think about history, or how, there are a lot of ways to kind of talk about this, but how the historical nature of our perception of the world, how that impacts how we think about almost anything, and what it looks like to give a very close historical reconstruction of anything, whether it's philosophy or science or kind of our day-to-day lives. And then that combined with these kind of pressing questions about how we look at the relationship between a kind of scientific description of the world and our human experience of the world, and how you mesh these things, or don't, for the lack of a better term, the kind of inconsistency between what seems to be a scientific description and our actual experiences of things, has always been a fascinating question. So that's really where I focused, writing a PhD and subsequently writing articles and books on stuff, but definitely in a very myopic fashion. And I don't really mean that in a negative sense, but to write academic, to write academic philosophy in this time period is to work on really specific problems in really minute ways. And I always hope that, so like going and reading my book would not be a particularly exhilarating experience for the non-specialist. I think I've always kind of wanted to write something more general, but I don't know if that's my skill set. But yeah, it's I do it. I do it, or I've done it because I find it fulfilling, which I think is maybe a great personal lesson, but not a great thing for other people. Because once I finish writing something, I'm like done. Like I don't want to talk about it. I don't really want to go back to it. Like, oh, it went to the publisher. Like, all right, can I never actually think about this again? Because I've been, looking at it for 6 months and I don't want to do it anymore. But of course, that's not how academia works, right? So then you spend the next 5 years talking about the same thing. So it gets a little exhausting, I think, in a sense, but still good.
That's the way I feel about games is like the second I'm actually done with it, I don't want to look at it again. But then there's, again, going back to bands, like if you write Pour Some Sugar on Me and that's your biggest hit, and congratulations, you have to talk about what that song means for the rest of your life.
Wow. Yeah. Be careful what kind of music you write. Jesus. Yeah. Well, that's true. Anything. I mean, even, my band was such a minor thing, but for 10 years, you're playing songs you wrote when you were 16. So at some point you're like, oh Christ, like, I don't want to, I don't want to, it's not, you don't want to do it anymore, but it's just like, so it's hard to imagine. Sometimes you think of bands like, Cannibal Corpse, you go, Jesus, they've been playing Hammer Smash Face for, 30 years or something, or 20 something years. Like it's got to get old a little bit.
Play the thing from Ace Ventura again. I want to hear that song.
Right. So, which is funny because think about how long some of this stuff is. Even Ace Ventura, people getting into death metal right now have probably never seen that movie. Like, it's such like a dated reference. It's not even
true.
Yeah, it's very bizarre that was such a big deal at the time. And it was. Like, I remember my friends just being like, oh my God. Because, you didn't see, at least we didn't see in the 90s, like the early 2000s, any representation of underground metal in like popular media, really. So anytime you saw it, it was like crazy. So to see Cannibal Corpse and Ace Ventura was like this mind-blowing thing because it was so front and center. Or what was it? Was it L7 was in Serial Mom, I think who it was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just stuff like that. Seeing underground bands in popular media was always just like holy shit, this is amazing. But now everything's so accessible now, right? That you can just Google death metal and find the whole history of the movement or whatnot, Yeah,
I remember seeing Jim Carrey on the Arsenio Hall show, like imitating death metal vocals. And I think, I'm assuming that he probably had a big reason why they were in that movie. But
I never really. I mean, I heard that he was a like death metal fan or a Cannibal Corpse fan, and he wanted them in the movie. But I don't actually know. I don't think I've ever asked anyone in that band how that ended up happening. That's interesting. I mean, because where else? I mean, you think about the time period. Like, where else did you see death metal bands in popular media? I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Like Anthrax was in Married with Children for one episode. Not really death metal, but kind of close. It's pretty wild.
Going back to philosophy and going back to the general, more broad, non-specialist philosophy, being the fact that you are a teacher of philosophy and that you teach all, you've taught all levels of philosophy from, entry-level stuff to very specific stuff. But I want to hear the hot takes. Who is the most overrated philosopher and who is the most underrated and why?
Who's the most overrated? Well, I mean, I hate Plato. I find it extremely boring, which is not teaching Plato and reading Plato. It's like, pour hot sand in my eyes. I would rather read almost anything than Plato. Something about the dialogue format and something about Plato's writing. I teach it because I feel like I'm somewhat obligated to do so. Like if you're taking an intro to philosophy class, it seems like you should at least read something by Plato in the beginning with Socrates in it, so you can say you did it. I don't know. Plato was just never particularly interesting. His ideas, to me at least, are not particularly inspiring. There's some people who wax, and just gush all over how much his writing is amazing, but it doesn't click. So I don't know. Underrated is hard. There's like a ton of underrated people. The answer to that in a sense is that I don't think it's specific people. So the history of philosophy, to the surprise of no one, I think, has been generally co-opted by like dead white guys, right? So if you go up until very recently, and this is still kind of the norm, if you go into like Barnes and Noble, not that anyone does that anymore, but if you did, if you go to Amazon and type in history of philosophy, chances are you would find, a book that's going to give you a history going from like Plato or people just before Plato up to Nietzsche or maybe Sartre, right? Or Foucault maybe. But it's all like, dead white guys. So, I don't know if I'd say there was any one philosopher who's underrated, but I would say that a lot of people in marginalized communities who were doing really good philosophy got absolutely fucking ignored. And that's particularly frustrating. Susan Langer is one American female philosopher who's phenomenal. But really, I've done some work on this woman, Grace de Laguna, who had this like brilliant career and wrote just like this amazing stuff. She did a great book. She published with her husband early on, wrote all these articles that touched on, like she kind of predicted certain advances in thinking about human psychology and development and evolutionary pictures. And she wrote on such an absurd variety of things and touched on so many different aspects of philosophy and intellectual issues, and has just been buried in the passing of time, So that kind of stuff's frustrating. I don't know. I mean, there's just so many people that are underrated that you could do an entire podcast just on that. And I think there are podcasts on this, right? The history of philosophy without any gaps or whatever the guy tries to like kind of put this through. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the answer is that, there's some sense in which knowing the potted history, it's been accepted by a lot of people up until now is important because you can know what this like distorted image is. But it's like there's so many brilliant thinkers that have been overlooked because that for the longest time was the focus, which is kind of absurd, right? That people bought this image of what philosophy is as this like oddly canonized, like, well, yes, the most brilliant ideas were these like 20 people. And it's a little absurd that it was ever given any place of influence. But, thankfully, I mean, a lot of work in philosophy now. I mean, philosophy is such a diverse thing that, practice that people work on all kinds of stuff. But there's a ton of work now to unearth or highlight a lot of these people who got buried essentially by that really canonical Western picture. So it's been great. But yeah, Grace de Laguna, if I was forced to pick like specific people vis-a-vis my interests, like Grace de Laguna and Susan Langer are probably the two who I think are horribly underrated. Just don't read Plato. Go do something better with your time.